almost 1,000 fewer that had lived there only 2 decades before. On that July evening in 1819, however, the rains had finally come, and they continued overnight, though too quickly for the drought-hardened ground. Shallow creek beds began funneling a torrential gush into the San Antonio River, where which picked up speed and force as it moved south towards the village. By dawn, the river was straining at its banks. A wall of water broke into the northern side of San Antonio just after daybreak, rushing through the streets with frightening momentum. The only bridge spanning the river cracked and shattered under the power of the rising tide. Water continued to force its way into town, drowning every street and plaza, before finally joining the San Pedro Creek on the far western side of San Antonio. Almost as soon as the flood began, there was no longer a town, only a wide, angry river. This assumed everything. The governor, Antonio Martinez, awoke to water pouring into his home. Going out into the flooding streets, the aged patriarch could hardly comprehend the scene. Every avenue had been transformed into a furious river, sweeping away screaming men and women who flailed about in desperate attempts to pull themselves to safety. Those lucky enough to snag tree limbs climbed high into the branches seeking refuge. Others tore off their clothes to keep from being pulled to their death beneath the water. The raging tide seized even more unmoored homes from their foundations. Poor families in San Antonio lived in rickety wooden huts known as halacals, built of timber plastered together with mud and clay. Martinez watched powerless as the flood ripped apart halacals, often with families inside, and houses began to disappear, leaving only fragments afloat to indicate the disaster that overtook them. The governor ordered his soldiers to pull anyone they could from the water, sending the best swimmers to rescue people who had taken refuge in the treetops. As the as the deluge continued, Martinez decided to abandon the town before the water rose any higher, ordering all survivors to follow him. Martinez led a march towards the hills outside San Antonio, where they huddled beneath trees. Then, as quickly as they come, the floodwaters began to recede, and when they returned, the survivors surveyed the destruction. San Antonio in 1819 was divided into four neighborhoods that corresponded roughly to directions on a compass. The northern and southern neighborhoods, where the wealthiest and most influential family lived, had been completely inundated, with the homes and buildings near the town's center sustaining the worst damage. The flood, however, had concentrated its fury on the poorer neighborhoods on the eastern and western sides of town. Raging waters had slammed hardest into the eastern neighborhood of Valero, where nearly every home had been a rickety halacal. Hardly a structure survived, as the flooding destroyed and killed indiscriminately. In the small western neighborhood of Laredo, the water rose so quickly that people trapped within their homes lashed together makeshift rafts in a desperate to avoid drowning. Many had not succeeded, and most of those who died in the floor came from either Vallejo or Laredo. Governor Martinez returned to his residence on the east side of the military plaza near the center of town. The receding water swept away many of the governor's household effects. Extensive damage made the home uninhabitable. Most other government buildings met similar fates. The royal corrals had been ruined and the livestock lost. Storehouses of corn had flooded, spoiling what little food reserves the town had. There would now be no harvest that year, and the fields just outside the village had been leveled. Like the governor, most residents had either been made homeless or lost their few possessions to the raging waters. Many no longer had clothes, having shed them to kept afloat during the height of the flood. No one could even be sure how many had died, and for days survivors toiled the grim task of recovering the dozens of bodies that washed up on the riverbanks downstream. 3 days after the flood, Martinez wrote two reports of disaster, one for the Commandant General in Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, and the other for the Viceroy of New Spain in Mexico City. Martinez described in frank and brutal terms the desolate scene of San Antonio, begging both men to send whatever aid might be possible to salvage the town. Martinez also brought out the dark irony of flood ravaging the same village that prayed for an end to the drought. God, it seemed to Martinez, was mocking the impoverished people of San Antonio. Divine providence, he wrote to his viceroy, lets them exist in order to witness and participate in the misfortune in which his divine majesty dispenses with impenetrable judgment. Though he wrote like God, Martinez saved most of his anger for the leaders of New Spain. The flood, while devastating, had merely exposed the decay left by what the governor saw as a century of neglect and mismanagement by Spanish authorities. Texas, he recognized, had always been treated by the Spanish crown as a distant, unimportant hinterland, leaving outposts like San Antonio, even before the flood, in desperate straits. When the violence of revolution shook New Spain during the 1810s, the result had been the rapid erosion of an already weak Spanish presence in Texas. In the years since, authorities in Monterrey and Mexico City had been either unable or unwilling to bolster Spain's position in the region, which struck Martinez almost as a willful abdication of responsibilities. In nearly every letter he wrote his government, Martinez complained of lack of support from his superiors that affected abandoned Tejanos. The Spaniards in Texas called themselves along New Spain's northeastern frontier to their enemies. His tirades about the impenetrable judgment of Providence then poorly masked Martinez's underlying conviction of the misery of Spaniards in Texas was tied directly to the poor judgments of the authorities in New Spain. What Martinez did not know, however, is that there was the powerful forces had been destabilizing the Texas borderlands in other ways that Mexico City could not control. Far beyond the confines of New Spain, a revolution in cotton had begun in Europe during the early 1800s when a burgeoning British textile industry developed a insatiable hunger for cotton as a cheaper, more comfortable, durable formed alternative to wool. The crop became almost overnight one of the most valuable commodities in the Atlantic world, unleashing an economic storm soon swept across the Atlantic and began reshaping the North American continent. One of the largest migrations in United States history ensued, as thousands of Americans poured into the Gulf Coast region that became the cotton south of the United States. Places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana were all alluvial soils and a long growing season promised ideal conditions for cultivating this new profitable crop. By 1819, as Martinez despaired for Texas, the revolution in cotton had remade the southwestern United States into one of the primary engines of the new cotton global economy. And because all this took place along the northeastern edge of New Spain, powerful forces unleashed by cotton began making their way across the landscape of Spain's tenuous holdings in Texas. Although Martinez could not know it, the desolate condition of Spanish settlements in Texas owed much of it to the rise of this new global cotton economy, as did the failings of Mexico City. Along the Americans who flooded into places near the Spanish border had come an equally powerful trading market geared towards supplying them. Indian nations in Texas, as a result, had vastly escalated the frequency and violence of their raids against Spanish villages in order to feed this voracious new market with horses and mules. American traders, hoping to profit from those tribes in return, established illegal trading posts in eastern Mexico, used while smugglers used the Texas coast to funnel enslaved Africans into the flourishing new slave markets of the Mississippi River Valley. The result was the dramatic reorientation of the economy and the economic and military power along the U.S.-Texas border that forced impoverished communities like San Antonio's to expand their few resources on repelling invaders and began to collapse Spain's presence in the region. Indeed, by the late